Okay, we're recording. Well, Mark, you made contact with me about the same time I learned about you. And since most people watching this already know something about me, why don't you introduce yourself a little bit?
Yeah, well, I used to be an Anglican priest, an Anglican clergyman, and so have quite a sort of long history of various kinds of struggles with Christianity. I say I used to be. I did a curacy, what's called a curacy in the Anglican Church, which is like a sort of 3-year period where you work underneath a more senior clergy person, a vicar. And by the end of that period, it became quite clear to me that it wasn't for me. And to cut a long story short, I've been on a kind of search ever since, in a way. And a crucial point in that search was discovering the work of Owen Barfield, who was, one of the Oxford Inklings that I know you've talked about before, and hence picking up the work you do on the internet, because it's not that often he's talked about, certainly in any kind of deep way. Every so often he gets a kind of name check, but not in any systematic way. So I was excited to see that you do talk about him, or have done, and hence, being in touch.
Well, I'm very excited about him for a number of reasons. I was reacquainted with him by the Fellowship, which is a book about the Inklings, about Lewis, Tolkien, Barfield, and Charles Williams. And then a couple of my listeners had started sending me references to Barfield in a pretty determined way, and I began to see the applicability of it. And actually, the further I go in a lot of areas, I increasingly see that I need to give Barfield a much closer look than I have. Could you maybe give us a little bit of background on Owen Barfield? Because again, a lot of people, they might have recognized the name, but they don't have any serious understanding of what he was involved in and who he was.
Yeah, so he was friends with C.S. Lewis, first of all. So he and Lewis were direct contemporaries at Oxford in the early 1920s, and began a friendship, it seems pretty much straight away. They met through a mutual friend, and at some level intuited that they were on a parallel track through life. But at the time, it was before Lewis became a Christian, so he was a pretty committed atheistic philosopher. Whereas Barfield, in his first year or so at Oxford, he had a period of, it seems, quite serious depression, with thoughts of certainly what's his life about, if not actual suicidality. He later described his life as like he didn't feel he was wearing the right pair of sets of clothing. He's obviously felt very uncomfortable in his own skin and so on. And then quite quickly, over one summer, he pulled out of that. It was partly because he fell in love, and he fell in love with a woman that he went on to marry. So that always makes a difference in life. But more particularly, it opened him up to felt experience, and particularly felt experience when he was reading poetry. And I think his sort of genius move was not to try to explain it too quickly, but to stay with the experience itself and see how far that could take him. And it persuaded him pretty quickly that poetry opened up new worlds that, as it were already present, but were just out of sight. And so he realized that the imagination, in particular, wasn't just a kind of nice to have that added a bit of color to life, but that opened up whole new dimensions of life if you let it speak to you. And this debate, particularly about what the imagination could and couldn't do, formed the first really intense exchange between him and C.S. Lewis, which they came to call their Great War. And Lewis was very much on the side at the time of reason told you what was true, and imagination kind of gave it expression. Whereas Barfield was saying, no, imagination can reveal to you what's true as well. And you can see perhaps how that fed into discussions about poetry, about myth, about words, the evolution of words, philology, all these kind of great interests that they shared. But I think it's always remembered that Tolkien had this great conversation with Lewis that precipitated Lewis's conversion, and maybe that was the kind of proximate cause. But I think that over a long period of time, these more extended conversations with Barfield, which in the way of the times were really involved. Involved very intricate, intense letters, discussions different works of English literature. That kind of prepared the ground, I think, for Lewis, so that he could, a few years further down the line, could be persuaded by Tolkien that Christianity was this historical myth, was this kind of true outpouring of the imagination, if you like.
Now Barfield, he was such an, I picked a lot of this up from that one book. In some ways, he had some frustrations, both some great frustrations and some great passions in life. It sounds like his relationship with his wife and his marriage was deeply rewarding and fruitful. He had to work for his father, and so he couldn't really pursue an academic career fully. But he became, his real contribution. Well, not really, he made many contributions, I'm sure, but one of his significant contributions was this area of words, and borrowing this phrase that really caught my attention: words have souls. What was Barfield's thought with respect to what words could teach us about the history of consciousness?
Yeah, so he felt that words have soul, and by that he meant quite a sort of minimal notion of soul, I think, just that they have a kind of liveliness, a vitality. They're animated, which is why they animate us, a bit like now, but also that they communicate a lively life to us, and in fact can even stand in for life in the form of a novel. A novel doesn't just feel like you're reading a description of a life elsewhere. It feels like you're in the life of the novel. And similarly so with poetry. So that's what he meant by words have soul. And then he made the sort of further step where he said, well, if they have soul and a kind of life, then can we track how that life might change over time? So that words, the first thing you learn as a philologist is that words change their meaning over time. So does this mean that the liveliness of words changes over time? And then does this even mean that what they can reveal and show us of life changes over time? So they become what he also called, in a very nice phrase, I think, fossils of consciousness. That the way a word is used at different points in time can reveal to us not just how the words change its meaning, but how the experience and perceptions of life themselves have changed over periods of time as well. And so he had this sort of minimal theory about words having soul and sharing the kind of vitality of the world. But then it developed into this bigger theory, which was that they reveal a kind of evolution of human consciousness to us, and how over periods of cultural time, rather than Darwinian time, he's talking over, say, the period of about 3,000 years, that you can know enough about the changing meaning of words over that time to show that actually human experience, human perception of what it is to be alive, to relate to others, to relate to nature, to relate to gods or the god, has really quite dramatically changed. And that became his kind of big thesis, and the one that's really gripped me.
Well, I'm very excited to talk to you, because this really interests me. I got started with making videos because of Jordan Peterson, and I listened to, I was just fascinated by the effect he was having on people, and part of why I got interested in Peterson was I was doing a lot of thinking, reading a fair amount of Lewis, and doing a lot of thinking about the strange circumstance that we find ourselves in the church. For example, going back to controversies with respect to, let's say, Genesis and science. You read the first few chapters of Genesis, and at some point you have to ask yourself, well, what were they trying to do in terms of writing this down? What was behind this? And this very much brought me into questions about why in the Reformation why is it, for example, the Eucharist and the Eucharist that became a central flashpoint in the Reformation? What do we mean by "this is my body"? And this very quickly gets you into a strange world of asking questions about truth and reference and language and how it works. And I've been following this trail back. I've been following the work of John Vervaeke, And he just in a video mentioned a transition in the 12th century from sort of a Lectio Divina type of language to a much more a use of language that we're more familiar with today, which is more propositional, more literal. And that got me to thinking about what words are and what words mean. And just recently I was listening to a Greek Orthodox father talking about, what the book of John is with respect to what reading it is supposed to accomplish in one's life. And of course, this very much gets into questions of liturgy. What are words? How do they function? How do they function with respect to people? And again, people started sending me Owen Barfield references, even books. And I very quickly saw with Barfield that he was doing a tremendous amount of thinking about reality and appearance and representation. Can you give us a little bit of insight about what at least some of the key takeaways you found from his thinking on this work?
Yeah, well, perhaps it's helpful to sort of try and articulate the account of Christianity, which I've found in him. And I've written this book that tries to tell the story of 3,000 years of Christianity.
I just opened it this morning. I got back from vacation. I'm terribly interested to dig into it. So thank you.
The sort of the preview.
Yes.
It's 3,000 years because I think the sort of crux of it was, and I think the reason why Jesus became such a pivotal figure in the West, at least, is because his life, either in itself or then the way that people reflected upon it, became this kind of pivotal moment in the evolution of consciousness as we know it now. And this is why Jesus has this special significance, this kind of pivotal significance. Even if you're not a Christian, you can still very quickly see how this figure so profoundly shapes our lives. And it begins to unfold a few centuries before, where in the very, picking up the threads from the earliest bits of the Bible, they fall into what you might call sort of prehistory, almost, and have a much more mythological feel in the very earliest texts of the Bible, the various early pericopes. So a figure like Abraham, for example, he's not nearly such a sort of fully formed person as, say, the figure of Moses is. He just has a kind of different feel. And Barfield argued that's because Abraham and the traditions associated with Abraham come from a time where people didn't have nearly such, they didn't have the same sort of sense of what it is to be a person as we do. And in particular, their individuality, their sense of being a person, didn't come from, as it were, the inside out, as we quite spontaneously feel that life moves, as it were, from the inside out. Rather, it came from the outside in. And so figures like Abraham, the historicity, I don't doubt there is some historicity behind it, but it's sort of lost in the midst of time. But part of the reason for that actually is because what was more important actually back then was how figures could accrue a sense of collective identity around them in the stories you told about them, even in the sort of what their very names came to mean. This is what people sought. And how things spoke to them. And what Barfield kind of argues is that this began to change very significantly around the time of the exiles in the story of the ancient Hebrews. When I wrote my book, I sort of tried to return to some of the biblical scholarship and the recent archaeology, which has even come on leaps and bounds since Barfield died in 1997. And it seems that particularly around the reign of Hezekiah, in ancient Israel. So when after the northern kingdom had fallen and Jerusalem was still standing, because of things that Hezekiah did almost that had been preempted a bit by the early prophets, the ancient Israelites began to form a sense of their themselves, sort of their religiosity mattered more to them from the inside out. It began to matter more from the inside out. So let me be a bit more specific. The earlier prophets, like Amos and Hosea, had said things like, it's not the sacrifice in the temple that God cares about, that Yahweh cares about, it's the broken heart that God cares about. Now, I think at first that would have been utterly bemusing, because it's not just, oh, we've got to change our religious practice and get a bit more ethical. It's trying to call forth a whole different consciousness. It would have seemed, what on earth do you mean? This is the time-honored way that we as a people know Yahweh and call down Yahweh's blessing upon us and know of our connection with Mount Zion and so on. But it's very much an outside in. So it starts to get unsettled by the prophets, like Amos, Hosea, Isaiah. I mean, again, if you read them and try and sort of peel back some of the layers which we now put on them as Christians, it's mostly a very disturbing experience that they describe. And, Isaiah, when he goes into the temple and says, holy, 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 I think initially that meant, what on earth is going on? Not, I feel I understand this God and it's got an echo of the Trinity. The subsequent reading. But so this starts to unfold, and I think that perhaps one of the reasons why ancient Judaism actually managed to survive these terrible periods of exile was because, unlike, say, the civilizations around them that were still very much into externalized forms of religion, they had begun to cultivate being able to carry Yahweh not just in a tabernacle or going to Yahweh in the temple, but carry Yahweh within. And in fact, biblical scholarship now shows, archaeology now shows, that when the Hebrews could return to Jerusalem, the diaspora stayed quite substantially, actually. It took, 2 or 3 centuries, really, for Jerusalem to rebuild up again in terms of the population. And I guess that for a lot of Hebrews, after the exile, it just didn't really seem that necessary to go back to Jerusalem. This kind of interiorization had taken place. So this sort of is unfolding. I think that apocalyptic ideas, again, which you read in the latest bits of the of the Old Testament of the Hebrew Bible, like in the book of Daniel, these two they require a different consciousness, because in a way what drives them is the concern for the individual. What is the individual's judgment going to be? Or how is the individual who in this life seems to have done all that was required and yet still have been punished or suffered, are they going to get vindication in another life? So apocalyptic ideas require a much more interior sense of what it is to be human. And then when Jesus is born, as it were, I think Jesus sort of comes at the sweet moment for this evolution, so that whereas Moses was said to have shone like God, like Yahweh, and people couldn't look at him, and it gets pretty close to identifying Moses with Yahweh. He's said to be Aaron's God at one point in Exodus, and then in the intertestamental material, Moses is, for example, in some of the apocalyptic material, said to be sitting at the right hand of God. I think there's a text called something like Ezekiel the Tragedian or something like that. So this is in the kind of Jewish speculation prior to Jesus' birth. But anyway, the point is that with this unfolding of consciousness, when Jesus is born, it becomes possible to see what Jesus is really about. As it were, if he had been born before, it wouldn't have been even conceivable. And in particular, I think, the great ancient Hebrew tradition that God is I am, that kind of comes echoing out of the word Yahweh itself. When Jesus appears, he can say, or at least people felt he was saying, my I amness too is completely transparent to the divine I amness. So that's the moment that consolates it all, that brings it all together. And, again, it takes time. And I think that the early Christians and the New Testament gives witness to this. They wrestle with what this really means, of course. This is what consciousness is like. But it's a pivotal moment. And Barfield he wrote an essay, a rather nice essay once, where he said, just by looking at the way that words change meaning, from having these outer references, as it were, feeding an inner life, to starting to be spoken of as if it's about inner life itself. He reckoned he could track a pivotal moment where that changed to inner life becoming more important to give expression to outer life, to the 1st century AD. And so, as it were, he said, even if Jesus hadn't been born, even if I didn't know about Jesus, I would expect that someone might have been around that would have given voice to this sense. So for me, it's been very exciting, partly because I find it very interesting, but because after my struggles with Christianity, it gave me a way of articulating the significance of Jesus that felt sort of with no need to compromise. You know, there's something completely full and manifest in this picture of Jesus. It doesn't need demythologizing. You can take the Bible fully seriously with all the recent scholarship, as well as what it's trying to communicate at a different level. That there's a tremendous synthesis that came together for me. So hence, getting quite excited about it.
Wow, I'm very excited to dig into your book. One of the ongoing series I have on my channel I call Words That Fudge, and what I mean by that is that we tend to have words that we use to words like spiritual, words like saved. I mean, I've used a lot of this. Probably one of my upcoming videos is going to be Words That Fudge on consciousness. Now, the part of consciousness has become a word that in so many different conversations is being used. And as I listen to it being used in different conversations, when I hear someone use that word, I always kind of stop and I listen especially carefully to try and figure out, okay, what exactly, what sense of consciousness do you mean? Because there's consciousness in terms of this, I think it's sort of a cloud through which we see the world, things come in and things come out. Consciousness in terms of our framing of the world. I mean, there's a lot of aspects to that word. So when you use consciousness in the way you just did it, can you sharpen up the resolution on that a little bit and flesh that out somewhat?
No, it's a very good point. I mean, I think it broadly means the experience of what it is to be human, to be a person, to be an individual. So it's how that experience changes over time. I mean, quite a nice example, back to what you mentioned before, at the time of the Reformation. It's only at the Reformation that words start getting prefixed with the word self. So you have sort of self-reflection, self-judgment, self-expression, all sorts of self-words start to appear, very soon after Luther and Calvin. And again, the sense there is that no doubt something had been unfolding in terms of what people were experiencing about what it is to be alive, to struggle to live well, to know what it is to relate to nature, to God, to others. But through what happened at the Reformation, it was where suddenly it crystallizes, suddenly it goes, we get it. And so words then appear to express that. So that's what I mean. My experience of what it is to walk into a woods now is very different from, say, what someone in ancient Greece would have felt when they walked into a woods.
Right.
I see dappled sunlight. My experience of it is perhaps shaped by some modern art. I have a vague sense of the biology, perhaps if it's springtime and the leaves are fresh. I know that they're beginning their kind of annual cycle in that way. This all shapes my experience of being in the woods. Whereas I think, in the ancient Greek world, the first experience would have been something to do with the spirits of the place. Was this a sacred grove? Was this a dangerous grove? What impression might be made upon me from the outside in? And I haven't just made that up. I also did a PhD on Plato, and in one of Plato's dialogues, the Phaedrus, the first quarter of the dialogue is when Phaedrus and Socrates go and try and find a spot by a stream, by a river in a woods. And the way they choose the spot is not that it looks beautiful. They try and discern what spirits might be present. And they want to find the place where it'll be optimum for them to have a philosophical discussion because of the spirits that are present. So the good thing, there are enough written records from this time that span this period of the evolution of our perceptions, evolution of consciousness, for us to have some fairly robust ways of talking about it.
I really love how you're framing this. I myself, so I grew up in the Dutch Calvinist tradition, but then my father pastored a church in a black community. And after college, I went to serve as a missionary in the Caribbean. And one of the things that all of these different cultural communities that I was deeply embedded in gave me a real sense of is exactly what you described, that I walk through, located in a city. I walk through a neighborhood. My experience of that neighborhood built on however many different filters I have is very different from someone of another culture coming through a neighborhood, someone who perhaps lives in that neighborhood, that we have all of this, life has all of this texture about it that is kind of contra a reductionistic naturalism. This stuff isn't material around us necessarily, and then to figure out, okay, well, how do we talk about that? How are these layers? I love the idea of fossils. How are these things? How are these things left behind, and how do they operate? So one of the things that I recognized when I was doing a Sunday school class on the book of Ezekiel was how, so here is Ezekiel in exile, along an irrigation canal outside of Babylon, and he has this vision of the throne of God and the presence of God coming there, and how in the ancient world the destruction of the domination of Jerusalem and eventual destruction by Nebuchadnezzar would have simply been understood as the triumph of Babylon's gods over the gods of the Hebrews. And in Ezekiel, you have this complete reframing of the situation, that Babylon is a tool in their God's hand. And as I was going through that book with my Sunday school class, I began to realize how revolutionary this was. And it wasn't just that here you have a crazy guy, Ezekiel, who, because of a bunch of the events of the book, some people wonder if he was schizophrenic because of all the things that they did to him. So it would be one thing to have a crazy man write a book and thinking that, okay, his God somehow worked through the destruction of his people. But these people won. And the book of Ezekiel is still here, and Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon are the talk of relics. And so then when I listen to you, and I, basically having learned from Barfield and what you just laid out, I find it so tremendously helpful, because after I've been a pastor now for 21 years in North America and a number of years overseas, I immediately began to, when you read the Old Testament or the New Testament carefully, you really do have the sense that, okay, we're reading a translation, or maybe I'm working in Greek and Hebrew, but we often don't know a lot of what they're talking about. And the choices they make about what they value, how they use language, just lead you to believe that these people are seeing the world through very different eyes. And if the Christian tradition that gives the Bible a fairly privileged status as canonical, well, these assumptions that they have and the way that they view the world is very important for how the church then handles this book. And obviously that was a crucial issue in the Reformation, but this continues to be a crucial issue today. And so it sounds like Barfield has, I think really a lot more people need to pay attention to, at least give him a hearing in terms of what he discovered.
Yeah, I mean, I think that his time really has yet to come, in that sense. An area where, the reading of the Bible became really crucial for me is saying Jesus' parables. So to sort of skip to another bit of it, but to ask, what are these parables about? And certainly in my experience in the Church of England, parables are nearly always turned into kind of moral tales. And I can remember for quite a long time being rather frustrated about this, because some of the parables clearly can be read in moral ways, like the Good Samaritan. But others of them seem uninterested in morality, if not actually unmoral. Like the unjust judge, or the parables of talents and things like this. And again, it was Barfield that really helped me to understand that if you reduce it to a level of morality, what you do is you're reducing it to a consciousness you already feel comfortable in. Ethics is a system that emerges from a consciousness that you're very familiar with. It's sort of a way of schematizing how to live in that zone, if you like. But what Jesus, I think, is constantly on about is opening up for people a completely different experience of what it is to be alive, to know God, to know others. And, I think it's what he called the kingdom. And the parables are absolutely crucial to this. It's a slightly hackneyed comparison, but nonetheless, I think they are a bit like Zen koans. They're stories that you're sort of supposed to wrestle with, and you feel you've almost got them. And that you need to almost be there, otherwise you'll just never get there. It'll just sort of whistle over the top of your head. But it's in that struggle that the potential to see the world in a completely different way starts to emerge. I think that you might be able to tell me this, but I think that perhaps Jesus' most common remark certainly in the Synoptic Gospels is, have they got eyes to hear? Have they got eyes to see and ears to hear? It's repeatedly said. And I think this is the main charge which presents us with, have we got the eyes to see? Have we got the ears to hear? So consciousness, for me, is absolutely central to it all.
Well, and part of this, and you find it in the Gospel of John, you find it throughout the New Testament, that the writers of the New Testament continue to insist that, well, we're coming up on, I'm thinking about my Pentecost sermon for this Sunday, and it's a startling thing in the New Testament that the disciples of Jesus spend all this time with him for 3 years, experience witness the crucifixion, bear witness to the resurrection, witness the post-resurrection teachings and presence of Jesus, witness the ascension, and in many ways continue to remain rather clueless until the opening words of the book of Acts: you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes upon you. And part of, over the last year, as I've been digging into just whole bunches of things, surrounding these types of issues and these types of areas. Okay, well, what on earth does that mean? And then again, when you look at Jesus' words, eyes to see and ears to hear, and you could not have said these things. His talk with Peter, it's not you thinking this up, seeing who I am. God has revealed this to you. And then Peter comes up with, yeah, well, we're not going to do this whole Jerusalem thing because that's going to get you killed. And, then get behind me, Satan. It's like, whoo, whoo. And so you begin to read this stuff and you're saying, well, how do we, how does this, how do we think about these things? How do we talk about these things? You look at the long history of Christian theology. You get to the, for example, in the Reformed tradition, the Reformation, where in some ways, John Calvin and many of the Reformers, well, this is what the Holy Spirit does. Okay, well, what do you mean by that? And how does this get manifest? And again, I think we're at a point in time where it seems, well, certainly in England, but even increasingly in America, there's a sense that some of the fruitfulness of the ways that it has been approached are reaching their end. And there's both a need, and I've experienced in the last year or two with a whole variety of conversations with Christians, atheists, and a whole group of people, also a new openness to, okay, let's look at this Bible. Let's talk about this Bible. And let's explore. One of my conversation partners has been Jonathan Peugeot, who grew up evangelical and then joined the Orthodox tradition and has become an icon carver. And so I listen to how he talks, and that to me has opened up kind of the Orthodox tradition. But yet there's still many different walls around things. Well, one of the interesting walls with Barfield, and one of the big contentions I know he had with Lewis, was Barfield's interest in Rudolf Steiner. And I know something of Rudolf Steiner because actually my wife teaches in a Waldorf school here in Sacramento, California. And so, his name has come across quite a bit. Who was Rudolf Steiner? Why did Barfield think he was important? And how do you think that impacts Barfield's view of Christianity?
Yeah, well, the quick answer is that when Barfield had sort of worked out his his idea about the evolution of consciousness. He was beginning to discover Steiner. So in the late 1920s, Steiner was very famous. He was very well known and was even becoming known in Britain. He was always quite well known in Germany, partly because he worked on the Goethe archive in Germany. And Goethe is the kind of equivalent to Shakespeare in Germany. So he was quite a prominent scholar. But he started his the last phase of his life. Steiner just sort of gave lectures virtually every night around Germany, and then he travelled and came to England as well. And so Barfield discovered Steiner and felt that Steiner had got onto exactly the same thing as him. But what I think particularly interested in Steiner was that whereas Barfield had kind of worked it out in a broadly academic setting, with a lot of feeling and a lot of heart, but nonetheless in a broadly academic setting, Steiner, who too had been an academic, seemed to have a kind of clairvoyant ability to just see these things almost directly. And I mean, if you'll probably know as well as I that Steiner, he first of all had this relationship with the Theosophists coming out of the 19th century, but fell out with them, and partly fell out with them because he had a vision of Christ, and so became much more Christocentric. He was always a sort of unorthodox kind of Christian, but nonetheless he was very Christocentric. And in particular, what that meant, I think, for him was that we're being called to change ourselves. That, as it were, it's not just about receiving mysterious texts or even particularly having odd experiences, and certainly not about reaching out to Eastern traditions. And there's something that's really important about Western consciousness here and now that's calling for something from within us that Steiner got onto. And I think Barfield found that very exciting, just to, as it were, independently, someone else was onto the same thing. Now, Steiner is a complicated figure. I always feel, I read this somewhere and it made sense to me that Steiner's work you can sort of break down into kind of three chunks. There's the chunk that you can read about, and it might be quite, oh gosh, but it sort of makes sense. And maybe a lot of the work that goes into the schools and his educational programs fits into that kind of camp. There's a sort of middle ground where, for example, he wrote quite a lot of commentaries on the Gospels, you could wrestle with it, and it becomes illuminating, but you're not quite sure what to make of some of what he says as well. So for example, Steiner was quite clear that such a thing as reincarnation existed, but it's very hard to know quite how that, even with an open mind, to know quite how that fits in with the Christian tradition at all. There are various ideas, of course, that you can read about, but for it to feel really firmly located in the Christian tradition is quite hard work. So that's a sort of middle ground. And then there's a sort of third area where Steiner just goes off, as it were, into some sort of visionary domain, and I don't even know how to read what he's writing, let alone make some assessment of it. Now, Barfield, I think part of Barfield's appeal is that you always feel kind of grounded with Barfield. He's open to all this, and yet he seems to explain it in ways that are easier to connect to. And certainly in Britain, Barfield became quite an important figure in anthroposophy, as Steiner's kind of group was called. I think because he was able to communicate these things in a much more direct manner. So they never actually formally met. Apparently there's one incident where Barfield did go to a lecture that Steiner was giving in Britain, and as it were, their eyes met across the room, but no more than that. But nonetheless, after Steiner's death, and then within the struggles within anthroposophy, Barfield became quite an important figure, reviewing books, writing articles, that kind of thing.
Is there a particularly helpful biography of Owen Barfield that you can recommend? There doesn't seem to be a lot about him out there, really.
Yeah, well, the fellowship that you mentioned at the top, this kind of literary biography of the four figures, including Charles Williams as well. That's pretty good. I think Barfield and Williams always play second fiddle to Lewis and Tolkien in it. But nonetheless, I feel that the writers there understood Barfield and what he was about. But there hasn't really been a good biography of Barfield written, in fact. There are biographical works that not only try and tell his story, but bring to the surface various texts of his that are otherwise lost in obscure journals or were never published. So they're kind of strange mixtures of slightly biographical, slightly anthologies, and sort of slightly sort of assessments and so on. I did wonder about doing a biography, in fact, but decided that my energy was drawn more to trying to, tell the story of the Christian unfolding through his ideas. There's a great website which is actually run by Owen Barfield's grandson, the Owen Barfield Literary Estate. He's also called Owen Barfield, in fact, and he's very much taken up the challenge of trying to get Barfield's work accessible, and so there's a lot of stuff on the website. They've republished all his books, so there's a kind of small but quite energetic community around him. And Owen Barfield, the grandson, when I told him about my project and we met, and it felt important for me to kind of almost get his blessing to feel part of that tradition, but also Owen Barfield, the grandson, did say to me that his grandfather had said, I'm not going to be like C.S. Lewis that speaks to my time, but I hope that I will speak to a subsequent time. And he reckoned it might be in the mid part of the 21st century, in fact. So maybe about now. Yeah.
Well, he seemed to have a real sense of time and timing from what you said about his reflections on the first century.
Yeah, I think the sense of, being on the cusp of something, whereas Lewis's role is always much more apologetic. It's about bedding down what's already around, if you like. So Barfield is perhaps just that. He had one foot in the future, and maybe it's our future. So I know Lewis seemed to have near zero respect for Rudolf Steiner and his work, while Barfield loved it. How did that play between them? It was the constant bone of contention. It was a thing that they never resolved. I think if I'm right, there's only one reference to Steiner in Lewis's work, which is in The Abolition of Man, where he makes some remark about, I've even heard that Dr. Steiner might have something to say, something like that about it. And it was a real frustration to Barfield, because Barfield always said that the thing about Lewis was that before he critiqued something, he read everything about it. So if he was critiquing an author, he read all their work. If he was critiquing an idea, he read all about the idea. But for some reason, he never did it with Steiner. And it was a strange sort of block. I think it was because my sort of guess is that whilst when Lewis became a Christian, the imagination took on a much sort of richer meaning for him. I think he still slightly felt that it should serve ideas that could be expressed in more rational form. He couldn't quite let himself go into a sort of full-blown mythology, which is why I think that the Narnia tales, for all their genius, they do have a kind of allegorical feel, rather than, as it were, the story feeling like it has a complete life of its own, as you find in Tolkien. So there's something about their kind of personal difference between them as well.
Have you read Michael Ward's Planet Narnia?
Yeah, I have. Yeah.
Okay. I was curious because that question about Lewis and Narnia and the value. I mean, of course, Michael Ward has his own theories about how that shakes out. Tell me, so why don't you introduce your book to me? I haven't had a chance to read it. Like I said, I just opened it this morning. I think the title might scare off some Christians, but tell me about how this book arose, what's in it, and why. Obviously, you don't write a book unless I'm sure you learned as you wrote it, and then why you think it's important that the world and who do you think should read it?
Yeah, I mean, it was a real learning process writing it. It was very much a struggle personally, because you can't really write about something unless you have some direct experience of it, I think. So it was a kind of unfolding of consciousness for me, the act of writing. It's called A Secret History. I wrestle with the title as you do with books, and because I wanted to be a bit tantalizing, but it's a serious point too, that the secrets of the kingdom is a biblical phrase, is a phrase that Jesus maybe even used himself. And I think it's very much saying This is about coming to live from a world that's already here, and yet we're not aligned with it yet. So it's secret in that sense that not that it should be, not in some Dan Brownish kind of way. It's secret because it's present all around us, and it's inviting us to enter its secrets, as it were, to enter its life. It speaks of interiority, I suppose. That I think that the thing that Jesus really planted in the early Christian period was how richly inner life might be trusted in a way. If in a way Lewis's struggle was with how much the imagination can be trusted, I think the early Christian period was very much how can your inner life be trusted. So notions like free will, like conscience, they start to become crucial subjects of discussion in the early church, because it's all about trying to realign life with this new dispensation. The book broadly, there's a kind of introduction that tries to just quickly outline Barfield's ideas, so you get the idea of the evolution of conscience in your mind, and then it goes through, beginning with the earliest parts to the Old Testament, through the period of exile, into the apocalyptic period. I do the same then with the Greek philosophers and try and tell a parallel story. It's partly because it's a world that I know fairly well, having done my PhD on Plato. But I think you can also, a sort of second run at the ideas gives you a richer sense of what's been got. Try and show it that much more. Then we come to Jesus, the birth of Jesus, and there's a kind of first chapter which talks about Jesus' teaching, and this thing about how I think what he was really onto was to try and shift people's consciousness. And then there's the period, particularly around the life, death, and resurrection, which introduces, I think, what's a crucial thing, which is that if you're going to start to rely on your inner life as a kind of parallel process, you need to be able to let go of your inner life in a strange way, as if it's your own possession. Because otherwise your ego becomes too inflated, to use a modern term. And this is why life and death absolutely go together in the Christian dispensation, and why Paul, in his more mature writings, will talk about learning to die every day. It's this process of, as it were, letting go of the small inner life in order that it can open up onto the big inner life. With full responsibility and awareness and awakeness, you might say. But it's this dialectic that Jesus lived, and then he absolutely had to, I think, so it becomes sort of completely firmly planted in the tradition. So that's that. And then there's a period about what I call Christianity's sort of high noon, which is late Antiquity, the medieval period, where this new awareness completely shaped Western civilization. It was easily the most dominant wellspring for people's lives. And then, of course, we come to the early modern period, scientific revolution, enlightenment, and so on. And I think this is another period where things are changing and things are on the move. And so in the last couple of chapters of the book, I try to get a sense of where we might be going now, and what we can learn from what's happened before in terms of what Christianity can mean going forward. And because I was interested when you said you felt both that there's a sense of sort of slight running to the end of things in other Christian discourse, but also a sense that maybe we can approach them afresh as well. There's a new kind of possibility in that. And that, again, that dialectic, something dying but something being born, feels very much where we're at now. So I try and give some sense of that in the last couple of chapters.
How did the book change you?
It helped me. It helped settle me in relation to Jesus, particularly as a figure, and then also my own kind of sense of spirituality. Really, I'm ambivalent about the church for a lot of reasons. Church of England is an established church, and that brings its own set of things you must wrestle with. Even when I was a clergyman, I felt very unsettled about what I thought about Jesus. You know, I wasn't the kind of person that had a dramatic encounter and conversion experience with Jesus. I was born in a Christian family. It was always, you know, part and parcel of my life. And so I always wrestled quite with what I made of the person of Jesus. I did have a phase where I thought I was an agnostic, if not an atheist, but, you know, in retrospect, it was always a passing phase. I've always felt the presence of the divine, you might say. But quite how the figure of Jesus fitted in, I found very difficult. But I feel that has really settled now. That I feel that Jesus, he opened up a way for us all to follow. And in particular, it's the mystical tradition that speaks to me now, that someone like Meister Eckhart can say, you know, the most important incarnation is the one that's happening in each and every soul now, rather than the incarnation that happened 2,000 years ago. That's the type that enables us to see what's happening within us, you might say. So, I mean, you talked about Pentecost coming up, and you know, we just passed Ascension, and I was thinking again, you know, what does Ascension mean to me? And then I thought, well, ever since Easter, the biblical stories around the resurrection appearances, it's like Jesus appears and then he goes. And then I work as a psychotherapist now. That's how I actually earn my living. And I was thinking about this game of peekaboo, you know, which you play with your kids, where you go, where's he gone, boo, where's he gone, boo. I thought, this is what Jesus has been doing. But of course, that's a very serious game for a child, because it's about the child being able to internalize things for themselves, and not have to have the external, you know, visual sense of safety. And I thought, well, maybe Jesus was doing something similar. You know, maybe that's what these stories mean. And the Ascension is the kind of final peekaboo, if you like. And then I love it that a lot of the resurrection stories, so the post-resurrection stories, Jesus often says quite hard things. I mean, you know, maybe this speaks to your Calvinist point. You know, so you know, one of the most famous is him saying to Mary, "Do not touch me." You know, now what's that about? And yet, he says, you know, but then he says, she says, "Teacher," and he says, "That's right. You know, that's what I am." But I'm ascending now to my Father and your, you know, my God and your God, my Father and your Father. I forget the quote exactly that, but nonetheless, you know, this is something which we now follow as Jesus did. We've got to work out, you know, a mature Pauline expression is to work out your salvation. So that's very much the kind of area, the terrain of Christianity that I find myself in now. And I feel I can relate to it directly and wholeheartedly, which is great.
And you know, it's interesting obviously in chapters in the Gospel of John, chapters, you know, the Last Supper discourse, that long discourse that's in the Gospel of John, where Jesus says, "I'm leaving, but I'm sending my Spirit." And you know, what do you mean you're leaving? And I think you set that. I never thought of the peekaboo, because I read the Bible, and you know, I've been reading the Bible all my life, but as a pastor, it's my job to continue to read the Bible, and I have to chew on it and to present it to my people new again and again and again. And so I read these things, and you read them, and I'm constantly struck with the oddity of so many things in the Bible. And if you can somehow hold back the instinctive, immature, you know, dismissal of things. Well, this doesn't fit my framework, therefore either force it into my category or just dismiss it as hooey. If you can just sit with it and say, okay, well, here it is, and I don't understand it, and there's strangeness to it. Well, let's take that as an invitation to, at least in my words, you know, let God, through his word, through the Holy Spirit, do something with this, that maybe he can open up my consciousness and open up my eyes and allow me. I mean, what is this now and not yet? What is this new creation? What is this new life? How does this penetrate us by this strange book called the Bible, which on one hand people so easily dismiss, but if you just look at just what has happened around the Bible throughout the course of human history, it's a terribly difficult book to dismiss. People have been reading this book profitably for a couple of thousand years, and it has literally changed the history of the world. And it's the strangest kind of book that scholars can't get to the bottom of, but you hand it to simple people and they walk away attesting that it was helpful. And you think, what a strange thing this is. I can't point to any other book in human history that's anything like it. And the same goes with Jesus and how many of these things. So, boy, I don't want to.
They're dynamic books. Words are alive again. To go back to almost where we started, words are alive, and so that means they have a life that isn't just, as it were, resting on the page, but read from the page and then taken into the human imagination, into a human heart, and they take on a life of their own. And I think you've got to do a lot of work. It is a struggle. It can be textual work, but it can also be personal work. But nonetheless, the great works of literature, like the Bible. I mean, I find something quite similar in Plato. Actually, I think again, there's a reason why we read Plato 2,500 years on. For me, that speaks even more to the importance of the Bible in a way. It's become the pivotal text. But that's the way they work. They do have a life.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to keep you too long, and what I want to do is I want to read your book, and I want to, I've picked up a couple of Barfield's other books, and I want to read them too, and I hope maybe after I'm a little better versed in him, I might be a better conversation partner to pull out of you more of the riches that clearly are there.
I'd be delighted. I mean, I'm on a bit of a mission now, with Barfield, reading the book, and if I may just say, I've got other material on my website if anyone wants to go and have a look. I made some little films and things as well, but it's very much trying to get the basic ideas out there and see how we can develop them, how they can really speak to our times. So conversations around that are absolutely crucial.
So tell me, so give me some ideas. How can people get in touch with your work? How can they get a hold of your book? When is it coming to America? All of these things.
Yeah, well, thank you. So I've got a website, which is markvernon.com, and you can sort of click on Barfield or the apparent link there. I think it's called Christianity and Consciousness, actually. And then that takes you through to various things from films, excerpts, that kind of stuff. The book's out at the end of August in the UK and the US.
Okay.
So the August 2019, it'll be freely available from then. I'm hoping to do events, hoping to come to the US maybe in 2020 in order to do events as well. I'm trying to build up some sense of how whether there's any momentum in the UK first, and then maybe come to the US afterwards.
Well, there is actually last night I spoke at the C.S. Lewis Society in Oakland, California, and they don't just focus on Lewis. They take Lewis and they like to do all kinds of things around Lewis. So if you get to the point of planning your trip to the U.S. and you're coming to the West Coast, let me know, and I might be able to help make some connections that could possibly help, and let fill up a room and give you an audience, because I also know some of the Rudolf Steiner people, at least in Northern California, and I'm sure Barfield's connection with them. I personally really enjoy bringing different groups of people together for meaningful conversation, and so I think Barfield is potentially a really interesting nexus for a whole bunch of groups that really don't talk much to each other for some reasons, to maybe be able to have some good conversation. So,
yeah, no, I think Barfield can both bring people together and cast a different light on things. So I'm hoping that the C.S. Lewis community, will be interested in him because of how he'll illuminate Lewis for them in a different way as much as anything else as well.
Well, thank you so, Mark. Stay on the line. I'm going to stop the recording, but I'm very grateful for your time and for this opportunity.
Yeah, well, thank you too for all that you do, and I'm delighted that we've made the connection.